Start out by introducing Paula Maccabee, and she is with Water Legacy.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm the lawyer and the advocacy director for Water Legacy, and Water Legacy is a grassroots nonprofit organization formed to protect water resources in Minnesota and the communities of plants, animals, and human beings who rely on those water resources. In a few years, we've grown from a handful of activists to over 3,400 members. Water Legacy works in alliance with other environmental groups like the great people you've got at this table, and also in partnership with Anishinaabe tribes. In Minnesota, we are very fortunate because not only are the tribal governments standing very strongly for protecting our water from the threat of sulfide mining pollution, but our tribal governments have departments of natural resources and have some of the best scientists in the state. So when I'm saying that Water Legacy is their partner, I think what I really mean is we love standing on their shoulders and benefiting from their years of expertise. Earlier this year, Water Legacy received an Environmental Stewardship Award from the Lake Superior Binational Forum, and U.S. and Canadian judges recognized Water Legacy for our ability to maintain successful partnerships and particularly to retain partnerships with tribes. Now I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about copper, nickel, and gold mining in sulfur-bearing rock, which we call sulfide mining, and the threats posed by this new and toxic form of mining. And then I'm going to talk a little bit, I did some legal research, so it might be throwing a lot of facts at you, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the rights and powers that tribes have in Minnesota, and then also what it will take from all of us, and that means tribes and Native citizens and non-Native citizens, as well as lawyers, to try and protect Minnesota lakes and streams, drinking water, wild rice, fish, and human beings from the toxic threat posed by sulfide mining. To begin our discussion, and I got this idea from a kid who spoke at the Environmental Congress last week. But what this guy said is that for too long, our white majority culture has acted as if we had a second planet to go to after we used up whatever we wanted to on this one. And from our perspective, that practice, that short-sighted view has to change. And the first thing we need to look at is realize that the precious water resources in Minnesota are not replaceable. The Great Lakes are the most important freshwater resource in the world. And these Great Lakes supply 84% of the surface water supply in all of North America and 95% of the surface water in the United States. Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake in the entire world by surface area, and the Anishinaabe who have lived by its shores for generations call it Gitchigami, meaning big water. The St. Louis River is Lake Superior's biggest tributary, and it's home to estuaries for dozens of species of fish. And this is the area that the first proposed sulfide mine in Minnesota would place at risk. Sulfide mining in Minnesota threatens precious freshwater resources across northeastern Minnesota. Other projects proposed threaten the boundary waters, and the first proposed sulfide mine threatens the Lake Superior watershed and the watershed of the St. Louis River. The first proposed mine, the Polymet open pit mine, would destroy over 1,300 acres of high-value wetlands in the Superior National Forest and convert more than 6,650 acres of what are now public lands to private mining company property. The Superior National Forest public lands that I'm speaking of are treaty lands where Anishinaabe people, who the white people call the Lake Superior Chippewa, have legal rights to fish and to hunt and to gather wild rice. The Treaty of 1837 says in Article 5, and this is a quote, "The privilege of hunting, fishing, and gathering the wild rice upon the lands, the rivers, and the lakes included in the territory ceded is guaranteed to the Indians during the pleasure of the President of the United States." So in other words, unless the President of the United States interferes with his treaty rights, those rights need to stay in place. From our perspective, the Polymet open pit mine would interfere with these legal rights of tribes as well as with downstream waters, which include Fond du Lac reservation waters and fish resources. Now, a little bit about Polymet. I think Catherine is going to talk to you in more detail and maybe show some pictures. Polymet open pit mine would create 375 million tons of waste rock. The Polymet
mine, and tailings dump would drain pollution into the St. Louis River watershed. And Polymet admits, and this is in a document that just came out this March, that their pollution from their waste rock would last for more than 200 years, if not forever. What you might not realize is that when copper or nickel or gold are taken out of sulfide-bearing rock, that sulfide is exposed to air and water, which creates sulfuric acid. In high enough concentrations, that sulfuric acid alone causes acid mine drainage, which is toxic to ecosystems and toxic to wild rice. But even in addition to the direct effect of sulfates and sulfuric acid, that sulfuric acid serves to leach or drag toxic metals out of the rock. Toxic metals like arsenic and manganese go into the drinking water. Most of us realize that arsenic increases the risk of cancer. What we discovered a couple years ago when the state of Minnesota was thinking of getting rid of its manganese standard is that at high enough concentrations, manganese in drinking water reduces the IQ of children. And that's why Water Legacy and a coalition of our supporters pressured the state of Minnesota, and they kept the manganese standard in place. In addition, the Polymet open pit mine and tailings dump would leach metals that destroy the aquatic ecosystem for fish, such as nickel and copper and cobalt, and also sulfates from the Polymet open pit mine and tailings dump would increase mercury concentrations of fish downstream. And that includes in the reservation of the Fond du Lac people and the places where the Grand Portage people fish for sustenance and part of culture, as well as just anglers. And that level of mercury can be toxic to babies. Last year, the Minnesota Department of Public Health, the Department of Health, published a study that showed that 1 out of 10 babies in Minnesota born in the Lake Superior region, at the time of their birth, in the umbilical cord blood, had levels of mercury that were above safe levels. And that mercury toxicity in Minnesota children up by Lake Superior is higher than the level in Wisconsin, it's higher than the level of Michigan. We have a problem right here that needs to be solved. Now, if you ever read the paper, Polymet is claiming in their press releases that their mine will be safe. But I've read the documents, and their claim that they're going to comply with water quality standards is based on false premises. First, they're assuming that their tailings dump won't leak. It's built on top of 3 streams. It will leak. Second, they're assuming that even if they blast it away at mine pits, there will be no fractures that carry the pollution away into groundwater and into streams. That's just plain not true. So what we're talking about is common in the mining industry. Polymet is making a false promise. We should not be deceived. Because across the country, the track record of sulfide mining is broken promises and polluted water. A study of sulfide mines across the United States done just a few years ago showed that 100% of sulfide mines in water-rich environments, in other words, not arid desert land, 100% of those mines violated water quality standards. And across the country, as we've seen in Minnesota, the companies go bankrupt and they leave their pollution behind. And that is why sulfide mining is the largest contributor to what taxpayers have to pay in Superfund liability. And that's more than $2.6 billion with a B so far. And that's actually just the tip of the iceberg, because the United States Environmental Protection Agency has estimated that from sulfide mines today, not counting the ones they're trying to put in Minnesota, the liability to clean up pollution is someplace between 20 billion and 54 billion. For tribes in Minnesota, this is an assault not only upon water quality, but on sacred monomen grain, which is affected by downstream, by the flow of sulfate downstream. It's a threat to hunting. The area that is proposed to be given away to the mining companies has moose and other important cultural animals to hunt, and also is a threat to contamination of fish, so that people will no longer be able to eat the fish, and the kind of contamination that is occurring now will not be cured as it is supposed to be cured under the Clean Water Act. So for Water Legacy and other allies of tribal people, protecting tribal rights and resources is part of our mission to protect Minnesota waters. We are interdependent, and we believe we are all responsible to protect our waters. We, as members of the white community, the majority community, are responsible to use whatever privileges we have, whatever tools we have, to assist the tribes who are really on the front line of this issue, whose ceded territories are at risk, and whose reservation resources are at risk. If I want to move away from a source of pollution, I can. But the tribes were only given very tiny pieces of land as reservations, and if those reservations are contaminated, that's it. They don't have another way to go. So what does this issue look like from a lawyer's point of view? I'm going to talk with you about some of the tools that tribes have. And what's great about this is I've had on my desk a pile of research I've been wanting to read for over a year, and because of today, I actually made my way through it. So I can explain to you what the law is supposed to do and some of the flaws in the way it actually works in practice. And then I want to share with you a few of our successes, because I believe it is possible to stop the juggernaut that is the sulfide mining industry. The power and the money are not invincible, but we have to work together, and we have to work strategically, and we have to embrace all of our shared areas of expertise. First, let's talk a little bit about tribal rights. First, as many of you know, and I know one of the speakers mentioned it this morning, treaties are the supreme law of the land under the U.S. Constitution. What does that mean? In the courts, the history of enforcing treaties is not very good, partly because treaties are not as specific as the kind of laws that white people put into statutes and regulations. The Treaty of 1837 that I read before protects the right of tribes to hunt and fish and gather, but does not say how much game can be depleted or fish contaminated before a court would say, treaty is breached, can't do it anymore. However, what we have in Minnesota is somewhat unique because both the Fond du Lac and the Mille Lacs bands actually have litigated the issue of whether this treaty is valid. And this was in connection with the DNR trying to control fishing rights. And the Mille Lacs band took this case all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the state was saying, don't worry about the treaties. They've been abrogated. Basically, we got rid of them when Minnesota became a state. Don't worry about it. And what happened is these arguments were rejected by the highest court of the land. And the Supreme Court said, not only is the 1837 and 1854 treaty valid, but it is an obligation in the courts to interpret Indian treaties to give effect to the terms that as the Indians themselves would have understood them. So there is a potential of bringing these treaty rights forward. The specific rights with respect to mining have never been litigated, so this would be a new ballgame. Some of you have probably heard of the Indian Trust Doctrine. What this is supposed to mean throughout our history, the tumultuous history of federal governments and tribal governments, is that the federal government is supposed to have a fiduciary duty to protect the rights of tribal peoples. However, from my perspective, although the United States has a clear duty to protect the rights of tribes, this is a duty without a clear set of standards. So for the most part, even in cases that have mentioned the Indian Tribal Trust Doctrine, if there have been favorable rulings, they've been on more narrow statutory basis. So I think we have to rely on the specific terms of statutes, not just on the Indian Trust Doctrine. Consultation is another area where I believe the promise reflected in law has been poorly fulfilled. The major laws that are at issue for sulfide mining, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, the National Forest Management Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, they all have obligations that require the government of the United States to consult with the governments of sovereign Indian tribes. In the case of the Polymet sulfide mine, the tribes are all quote-unquote cooperating agencies, supposedly standing at the same level as any other governmental agency. However, in the white culture, too often consultation is seen only as a procedure, not as a substantive requirement that when governments get together, they reach consensus or reach agreement. So let me explain how this works. When my daughter was 2 years old, we took her to a doctor because she wasn't behaving real well. So we thought she might have some problems with her ears, and the doctor went through a battery of tests. And we came out, and he looked at us in the eye, and he said, our daughter was not hard of hearing. She was hard of listening. So from our perspective, consultation with federal agencies often works the same way. They may be able to hear, but that doesn't mean they're going to listen. So even though consultation is very valuable, the kind of leverage that should be in law as a result of consultation is often not accorded to tribal governments. In addition, our laws and the Environmental Protection Agency has very clear laws, and there's also an executive order from the president that dates back to Bill Clinton's days that says that permits should not be granted by the federal government if they have a discriminatory effect on tribes. And in the case of the polymet sulfide mine, it seems really obvious that that mine would have a discriminatory effect or a greater effect on tribes than it does on other people in Minnesota. The land itself is the Superior National Forest. It is ceded territories. It is lands to which tribes have rights to hunt, fish, and gather, which are different from those of everybody else in Minnesota because we didn't have to give up sovereignty. Also, the polymet mine is right upstream of the Fond du Lac tribe. Any pollution in that St. Louis River is going to go right by their doorstep. And so we believe that the issue of environmental justice, the effects of Polymet's open pit, its waste rock dumps, its tailings dumps, that's an environmental justice issue. And the Commissioner of the Pollution Control Agency has said he wants to put more emphasis on environmental justice. I think we need to ask him, make Polymet your first test case. Look at what it's doing to the wild rice downstream, look at what it's doing to reservation resources, and help us get some balance in the way this is being looked at. Finally, I think our most important tool is the Clean Water Act. Under the Clean Water Act, any person who is harmed by pollution can have their day in court. But in addition, tribes who have gone through a federal process, a kind of long and awful federal process, to be treated as states, they have an additional right that when a federal permit is going to be issued, like the permit for wetlands destruction that the Army Corps is going to issue for Polymet if it ever gets to that point, before that permit could be issued, tribes have a right to look at that permit and say, if it was granted, would it comply with the Clean Water Act? And tribes in that sense can be treated the same as a downstream state. They can't veto the project on their own if the pollution originated outside the reservation. But they can bring that to the United States EPA, and there's a process where the EPA has to listen to the tribes. And that is spelled out relatively clearly in law. So we have, through the expertise of the Fond du Lac and the Grand Portage and the Bois Forte Band, and the specific relationship of the Fond du Lac as a downstream water, a chance to bring a special claim under the Clean Water Act to the EPA. So there are some tools, guys, but what are we up against? You can see from my quick review that even though there's some legal tools, there are also a lot of areas where these powers have not been tested, and our laws don't always work the way they're supposed to. As we face the threat of new and toxic sulfide mining, we're also up against money and power. Glencore International is the backer of the Polymet sulfide mine. What we're talking about today is how to make sure they don't do what they were planning, because Glencore is a multinational corporation that around the world has left a legacy of pollution as well as human rights violations for its own workers. And that is a $60 billion multinational conglomerate. And many politicians are quick to line up and say we need sulfide mining. But it is not inevitable. We have had some important successes. Despite all their time and money, Polymet plan has not gone forward. They put forward their draft EIS in October of 2009, and as a result of the work of the Anishinaabe tribes who were cooperating agencies and the environmental groups and 3,000 citizens, the United States EPA acted and said the plan was not good enough. And in a very rare instance, the EPA gave both the plan and the Polymet project itself a failing grade. So they've now spent 3 years trying to sandpaper their plan, hoping that it will be approved. There will be a new report from Polymet, a new supplemental draft EIS coming out this year. And it is important that everyone sign up. Water Legacy is in the back. We have a petition about sulfide mining. Sign up and we will let you know when that new plan comes out so that we have a chance to comment and push back. Another important victory has been the sulfate standard for wild rice. One of the first things the mining companies did when they wanted to get their Polymet project and other sulfide mines pushed through is they took aim at the wild rice sulfate standard. And they said, we have to get that off the books. So they filed a lawsuit in December 2010 to get rid of the sulfate standard. And Water Legacy intervened because we weren't sure the estate would fight to keep the standard. and we made a motion to dismiss and a motion for summary judgment. And after a lot of briefs and arguments, the wild rice sulfate standard was upheld in the district court, it was appealed to the Court of Appeals, and it was upheld again in the Court of Appeals, and the mining company's claims were all dismissed. So what do we need to do? We all have a sacred duty to protect our clean water, our wild rice, our fish, and a way of life for tribal and non-tribal people in Minnesota. There is much work ahead, but I believe on our side, we have good science, we have resolute and effective use of law, and we have the voices of the community. We have tribal expertise, and we have the voices of people who are willing to write letters, make phone calls, and come and testify. No sulfide mining until it is proved someplace else that this is safe. Let's not put our precious waters in Minnesota at risk. Let's not be the experiment that may go wrong. Thank you. Please join us.